Not long ago, on a snowy morning with flakes filling the sky, a black Mustang was speeding along a winding mountain road. Watching the darkening sky and the huge snowflakes falling outside, the man behind the wheel looked unusually joyful. He was a famous writer named Paul, a man who drove luxury cars and lived in a mansion. He had just finished another great novel in his secluded writing retreat. Now he was heading back to town with his manuscript, completely satisfied. But everything that happened next would become a nightmare Paul could never shake. Halfway through the trip, the blizzard grew even more intense, and visibility outside the window dropped to almost zero. But the stubborn Paul chose to keep driving anyway, and before long, the car's wheels lost control and began to skid. Even though he slammed on the brakes again and again, the car still spun out and rolled down the hillside, leaving Paul badly injured and unconscious. Fortunately, not long afterward, a passerby arrived and managed to pry open the car door with an iron bar, pulling Paul out and performing CPR. After confirming that he was still alive, the person casually tucked Paul's finished manuscript into their coat, hoisted him over their shoulder, and disappeared into the blizzard. When Paul groggily opened his eyes again, he found himself lying in a bed with an IV drip attached. The woman standing before him introduced herself as Annie and said she had been Paul's most loyal fan for many years. Annie explained that the heavy snow had blocked the mountain and cut off communication and transportation, so she had no choice but to temporarily bring him to her home. Before moving to this remote mountain area, Annie had worked as a nurse, so she still had basic medical equipment available to treat him. Looking at Annie's kind and gentle appearance as she thoughtfully brought him water and medicine, Paul felt somewhat reassured. But when he looked down helplessly at his legs, both broken from the crash, he realized he had no choice but to stay in bed and recover for a few days. Then Annie said she wanted to read the manuscript Paul had just written. Since she had saved his life in the middle of a snowstorm, Paul naturally agreed without hesitation, but he never imagined that this decision would mark the beginning of his nightmare. Paul had originally been driving back to New York to deliver the manuscript, but the accident had left him with multiple fractures. All Paul could do was give Annie the phone numbers of his agent and his daughter, asking her to go into town the next day and let them know he was safe. Meanwhile, in New York, Paul's agent still hadn't received the manuscript and was anxiously trying every possible way to contact him. Eventually, the agent decided to call the local sheriff for help. When the sheriff heard that the famous author might have had an accident in his town, he rushed to the hotel where Paul had been staying to investigate, only to learn that Paul had already checked out several days earlier. Back at Annie's house, Annie had already read more than 40 pages of the manuscript, but the vulgar language scattered throughout the story made her feel that the book was beneath the dignity of its readers. Paul explained that such language was necessary to shape the characters in the story, but to his surprise, Annie suddenly flew into a rage, as if a completely irrational personality had taken over. She began arguing with Paul and scolding him, insisting he should never write things like that. Her face flushed red as she kept ranting non-stop, even splashing the soup from her bowl onto the bed as she talked. Then she angrily stood up and continued shouting at Paul. But after their heated argument, Annie suddenly did a complete 180, bowing repeatedly and apologizing to him. Paul pretended to stay calm, but deep down he felt a chill creeping through him. Meanwhile, the sheriff, still unable to find Paul, decided to drive along the road Paul had taken to search for clues. Along the way, he suddenly noticed a broken tree branch that looked like it had been hit by something, so he immediately got out of the car to investigate carefully. However, the snow was simply too deep, and the sheriff eventually had to turn back, never realizing that Paul's overturned car was buried under the snow not far ahead. As the sheriff got back into his car to leave, Annie happened to be returning from town and passed by him. Seeing that the sheriff had come back empty-handed, Annie couldn't help but smile with satisfaction. When Annie returned home excitedly, she took out the newest published book in Paul's Misery series and showed it to him. Paul had originally become famous because of the Misery series, but over time he grew tired of it and felt he shouldn't be trapped by the same storyline forever. So in the final installment of the Misery series, he had simply written the main character, Misery, to die. But Annie, who loved the Misery series deeply, had no idea about the tragic ending yet. Every day, she sat by Paul's bedside, happily sharing her favorite parts of the book with him. But after listening to it all day long, Paul had grown completely fed up. Annie's obsession with Misery had practically driven her insane. She had even named her pet pig Misery and brought it to Paul's bedside to introduce them. Late one night, Annie finally reached the ending of the book and discovered that Misery had been killed off. Since the character had helped her through the darkest period of her life, Annie stormed over to the bed in anger and demanded an explanation from Paul. Paul tried to explain that Misery's spirit still lived on, but Annie, blinded by rage, refused to listen.
I don't want her, bitch! I want her! And you murdered her!
Enraged, Annie grabbed a nearby stand and smashed it hard against the headboard of Paul's bed. Then she launched into a long tirade of accusations and complaints. Before leaving, Annie bluntly told Paul that when she went to town, she hadn't called anyone at all. He shouldn't expect anyone to discover him or come rescue him. After saying that, she proudly drove away. Watching Annie's car disappear into the distance outside the window, Paul decided he had to find a way to escape this hellish place on his own. But as soon as he struggled out of bed, the pain from his broken legs made sweat pour down his entire body. By the time he finally dragged himself to the door, he realized that Annie had already carefully locked it from the outside. Exhausted and helpless, Paul leaned against the door and eventually fell asleep there. The next day, when Annie returned home, she saw Paul lying on the floor after spending the entire night there. Guessing that he had tried to escape, Annie brought a barbecue grill inside. On it lay the manuscript of the book Paul had just finished and was preparing to publish. Annie began pouring lighter fluid all over it. She said she was going to burn the manuscript because of its vulgar language, then handed Paul a match and demanded that he light it himself. Paul tried to act as if he didn't care, claiming he had already printed many copies of the manuscript, but his trembling hands refused to strike the match. While listening to Paul's excuses, Annie casually poured the lighter fluid onto the bed beside him. As Paul's #1 fan, she knew perfectly well that whenever Paul finished writing in a remote hotel, he always kept the only copy of the manuscript with him. Realizing she knew the truth, Paul had no choice but to give in and toss the lit match onto his manuscript. Helplessly, he watched the work he had struggled to complete slowly burn into ashes drifting through the air. At that moment, the sound of a helicopter suddenly echoed across the sky, and Paul felt as if he had just grabbed onto a lifeline. He anxiously turned his head toward the window to see what was happening. It was the sheriff searching for Paul from the air, but the sheriff only glanced down briefly. When he didn't see Paul's classic Mustang anywhere, he assumed Paul wasn't there and flew away. Seeing this, Annie finally relaxed. She then brought Paul several painkillers, but Paul didn't take them right away. Instead, when Annie left the room, he secretly hid the pills under the mattress. From that day on, Paul never dared to take the medication Annie gave him. Each time, he quietly hid it under the bed. But Annie unexpectedly brought him a wheelchair and even bought a desk, chair, and typewriter from town. She demanded that Paul continue writing the Misery series and insisted he bring the character Misery back to life. Since Paul's injuries hadn't healed yet, he had no choice but to obediently follow her instructions. But perhaps fate had its own plans. One day, Paul noticed a hairpin lying on the floor. An idea suddenly came to him. He typed a few words on the typewriter. Then he pulled the paper out and lightly rubbed it with his hand, causing the letters to become blurred. Paul said he needed white bond paper and asked Annie to drive into town to buy some. Annie angrily threw a book at his legs, saying the paper she had bought was already the most expensive kind available. But in order to see Misery resurrected as soon as possible, she still rushed into town to buy it. As soon as she left, Paul bent down, picked up the hairpin, and inserted it into the keyhole. After fiddling with it for a moment, the locked door opened easily. Paul first went to the living room to call for help, but when he picked up the phone, he realized it was only a fake prop Annie had set up. Meanwhile, Annie had already bought the paper in town and was on her way back, while Paul continued searching the house for a way to escape. At one point, he almost knocked over a penguin figurine. Luckily, he caught it quickly and put it back exactly where it was. Exactly. He then entered a small storage room and grabbed a pack of painkillers, hiding it in his waistband as part of an escape plan he was secretly preparing. Paul went to the kitchen and discovered he could escape through the back door, but the narrow doorway forced him to crawl painfully step by step toward it. Just then, he heard the roar of Annie's car approaching outside. Panicking, Paul hurriedly crawled back into the wheelchair, shut the living room door, and returned to his room. But before he could hide the pills at his waist, Annie suddenly pushed the door open. Paul quickly covered his stomach with his hand and pretended to be in unbearable pain, begging Annie to bring him painkillers. After she left, Paul took out the stolen pills and poured their powder together. At the same time, after days of unsuccessful searching, the sheriff finally discovered Paul's overturned car, but no body was found nearby. Judging from the marks on the car door where someone had pried it open, the sheriff concluded that Paul had been rescued. However, Paul's whereabouts were still unknown after being rescued. With no other leads, the sheriff bought several of Paul's books, including the entire Misery series, hoping to find clues about his disappearance. Meanwhile, Paul spent every day typing away at the typewriter. When Annie finally read the part where Misery came back to life, she was so happy she danced around the room with excitement. She even prepared a candlelight dinner to celebrate the moment. While Annie stepped away to get candles, Paul took out the powdered pills he had prepared earlier and poured them into her drink, carefully swirling the glass to avoid suspicion. Paul thought his escape plan was finally guaranteed to succeed, but when Annie returned and raised her glass, she accidentally bumped a candle on the table. Then, by sheer bad luck, she knocked the wine glass over as well. Paul stared at the scene in disbelief, completely stunned as his carefully planned escape failed yet again. After several drinks, Annie's face flushed red from alcohol as she approached Paul with a sorrowful expression. She confessed that she had always truly loved him, but she also knew knew that Paul could never love her, and she knew that once his legs healed, he would definitely find a way to escape her cabin. As she spoke, she pulled a handgun from her pocket and said that when she felt sad, she sometimes couldn't stop herself from pulling the trigger. Afraid she might hurt Paul while he was writing, Annie decided to leave the cabin and go outside to calm down. Her terrifying words frightened Paul so much that he grabbed a kitchen knife, ready to defend himself at any moment. But while walking back, Paul accidentally noticed a scrapbook lying on the table. Curious, he picked it up and began flipping through the pages. It was filled with newspaper clippings and photographs about Annie. Halfway through reading it, Paul was shocked to discover something horrifying. At several hospitals where Annie had once worked, mysterious patient deaths had repeatedly occurred at night. Every one of those incidents had been linked to Annie. After investigating, the police eventually arrested her as the killer. The media had even given her a chilling nickname, the Angel of Death. The more Paul read, the colder his spine felt. Terrified, he returned to his room and lay down, hiding the knife inside the white bandage wrapped around his right hand while repeatedly rehearsing how he might defend himself. Late that night, Annie finally returned. But instead of entering Paul's room, she only lingered outside the door for a moment before leaving again. Relieved, Paul hid the knife under the bed so he could grab it quickly if necessary. But what Paul never expected was that later that night, when he half woke from sleep, he saw Annie silently standing beside the bed, her face twisted with a sinister expression as she stared at him with hatred. Before he could react, she injected him with a syringe. Paul soon lost consciousness. When Paul woke up the next day, he found himself tightly tied to the bed. Like a helpless lamb waiting to be slaughtered, he couldn't move at all. Annie told him she knew he had left the room because the penguin figurine in the living room had been moved. Paul thought about the knife hidden under the bed, but he couldn't reach it. Seeing this, Annie immediately pulled out the knife he had been searching for. She then explained how the owner of a South African mining company used to deal with workers who stole from him. He would brutally break their legs. After saying that, Annie placed a wooden block between Paul's legs. Then she took out a hammer she had prepared earlier. Without giving Paul any time to react, she mercilessly swung the hammer down. Paul's legs were permanently crippled. Still not satisfied, Annie turned around and struck again, causing Paul to scream in unbearable agony. The next day, while the sheriff was relaxing outside after another day of investigation, he saw Annie driving into town again to buy supplies, even shouting vulgar insults at passing pedestrians. The sheriff knew Annie lived alone and wouldn't normally need to shop so often. So after she left, he went into the store and asked the owner about her purchases. The owner said Annie had recently been buying things mostly related to writing, like a typewriter and large amounts of paper. After hearing this, the sheriff went back to the police station and pulled up Annie's file. There, he found old reports about the hospital where she once worked. She had personally killed dozens of patients before eventually being arrested and imprisoned. Only after being released did she retreat to live alone in the mountains. The sheriff also noticed something else in one of the newspaper photos. A line printed beneath it was exactly the same as a quote spoken by the character Misery in Paul's books. He suddenly realized Annie was Paul's fan. This immediately made him suspicious, so he rushed to Annie's house in his patrol car. When Annie saw the sheriff's car approaching, she quickly injected Paul with a sedative. Paul tried to resist at first, but the drug quickly took effect and he passed out. Annie dragged him into the basement and hid him there. Then she calmly opened the door to greet the sheriff, acting as if nothing had happened. She told the sheriff she had recently been trying to imitate Paul's writing style, which was why she had bought a typewriter and paper. The sheriff searched the house for a long time, but found nothing suspicious. Just as he stepped out the door to leave, he suddenly heard a noise from the basement. Paul had regained consciousness and knocked over a nearby grill to attract attention. The sheriff turned back, opened the basement door, and saw Paul sitting helplessly on the ground with crippled legs. His suspicions had been correct, but before he could rescue Paul, the ruthless Annie seized the opportunity and shot the sheriff from behind. And just like that, the sheriff died in the most absurd way. Paul was so terrified that he didn't dare make a sound. Annie calmly put away the gun and said that now she planned to die together with Paul. That way, they could be together forever. As she slowly walked toward him, Paul desperately came up with a delaying tactic. He suggested that he could finish writing the Misery series that very night. That way, Misery could live forever. Annie liked the idea. Since the police wouldn't find the cabin tonight anyway, she gave Paul one night to finish the story. While she wasn't looking, Paul quickly stuffed a bottle of lighter fluid into his pocket. He kept writing until 11 p.m., finally reaching the last chapter. Annie eagerly waited to find out how Misery would survive in the ending. Before finishing the final page, Paul asked for a bottle of champagne and a cigarette. Annie knew this was part of his usual writing ritual, so she obediently went to the kitchen to prepare them. When everything was ready, Paul asked for 2 glasses this time, saying Annie deserved credit for Misery's resurrection. Annie was thrilled, but when she turned around to get the second glass, Paul suddenly threw the manuscript onto the floor and poured lighter fluid all over it. He held the final page in his hand and struck a match as Annie walked back in. Seeing this, Annie was completely confused by Paul's behavior. Paul then vented all the suffering he had endured and said this was finally his chance for revenge. revenge. Without hesitation, he struck the match and burned the final page. To provoke Annie even further, he used the burning page to ignite the rest of the manuscript. Annie went completely insane and rushed forward, desperately trying to put out the flames. Taking advantage of the moment, Paul lifted the heavy typewriter and smashed it against Annie's head with all his strength, but Annie refused to give up. She staggered back to her feet and grabbed Paul by the throat with both hands. Paul dug his thumbs into Annie's eyes and pushed her to the ground, but Annie immediately pointed the gun at him again. Fortunately, the shot only hit his arm. Paul lunged forward and the gun fired its only remaining bullet. After that, the two could only fight each other with their hands. During the struggle, Paul managed to trip Annie and she crashed heavily onto the typewriter. Blood poured from her head and she lay still for a moment. Seeing the opportunity, Paul crawled toward the door, but Annie suddenly lunged at him again like a relentless parasite. Desperate to silence him forever, Annie attacked once more. Paul grabbed the small pig statue from the floor and smashed it into Annie, finally killing her. In the blink of an eye, 18 months passed. Paul now walked with a cane every day. But whenever he discussed publishing his books with his agent, those terrifying memories would return to haunt him. Sometimes in restaurants, he would even mistake a waitress pushing a serving cart for the terrifying Annie. It turned out Annie had become an indelible nightmare buried deep inside Paul's mind. At that moment, a waitress walking toward him suddenly told Paul that she was his most loyal fan. After hearing that, Paul forced a chilling smile.